just so exciting for our commercial producers whom we serve that they're in a marketplace that's expanding and there's a vast appetite for more pork. And we're the people who provide this unique and leading genetic breeding stock to them to start that whole cycle. It's exciting to be in a growing global business, and we're step one in the chain.
My name is Matt Romosier. I'm a field specialist with the Iowa Pork Industry Center, and we'll be moderating this afternoon's session where we're discussing and diving into more of the research side on sow management and production. First speaker for this session is Dr. Kara Stewart. Kara received her bachelor's degree from Purdue in 2001 and her master's and PhD from North Carolina State with Dr. Billy Flowers in 2004 and 2008, respectively. Kara taught in the Animal Science Department at NC State for 2 years before returning to Indiana to work for Cook Incorporated, a human medical device company. And in July of 2013, Kara happily accepted a faculty position in reproductive physiology in the Animal Science Department at Purdue. She carries a majority extension appointment, working across several species and predominantly in swine, and teaches a reproductive management and reproductive physiology courses for undergrads. Her recent research is focused on mitigation strategies for heat stress in boars and sows, biomarkers of fertility and seminal plasma for boars and vaginal samples from weaned gilts, and methods to improve survival in piglets. So with that, I think looking forward to a good topic here on colostrum and managing the young pig. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kara.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I'll try to keep you awake after that good lunch that we all had. So I am part of the survivability grant that Jason Ross talked about this morning, and my role in that grant has been to look at pre-weaning mortality and kind of managing the young pig. And I hadn't done a lot of research in this area prior to getting involved in this grant, with the exception of the fact that I've personally lactated 4 times and fed 4 kids. And so thank you. And so I have always thought milk was just like amazing. It's just this golden, amazing fluid. And so I paired up with a lactation biologist at Purdue, and we had just started doing a little bit of work on how do I walk into a barn and identify piglets that have drank enough colostrum and those that haven't. And so when I started talking with Jason about the survivability thing, I said, well, I'd like to join if the team would allow, and really start to focus more in that area. So I've been really lucky, I think. I have really enjoyed working with all of the group of researchers on this grant, as well as getting to know a lot more producers and things. And I think I'm now really motivated, maybe you'll sense my excitement today, about this area, and interested in continuing on working in the area of survival of these little piggies. Ooh. Oh, I gotta turn it on, that helps. Okay. So where are we on pre-weaning survival? I think we've already seen some of this data this morning. So this is just PigChamp data instead of some other sources. But I have the pre-weaning mortality on the left and the total born from PigChamp on the right, looking at it from 2004 to 2020. And if you look at the slopes of those lines, we are sort of going up at the same rate. So as we are producing more, we are losing more. And I make fake data, so I'm going to caveat that I thought, let's look at 2010 versus 2020 on a per 100 pigs basis. And if we look at what our total born was in 2010 versus 2020, we have 12.8 pigs versus almost 15 pigs total born, but with a 12.6 versus 15.4 pre-weaning mortality. So if you look at that over 100 pigs, in theory, we aren't even saving them as much as we are producing them. Now, we saw better data that wasn't fake this morning that shows that we are weaning more pigs than what we are, than how many we're losing. So this isn't real, but if you saw in those graphs, especially by Dr. Pullman, the bottom is really starting to drag us down a little bit, right? So the top is doing very, very well, but the bottom isn't. So the bottom is really not keeping them around as fast as they are producing them. The top is. So we do need to come up with some methods or talk about how do we start to save pigs across all units. And I think the other thing that Dr. Pullman told us this morning was we want to start focusing a lot more on the variation versus the extremes or the averages of all the data. So this is what I've been working on with the mash-offs here over the past couple of years, doing some research on their farms and starting to break down to see which of the piglets are actually the piglets that are dying. So if you look at research papers, they call them light, medium, and heavy weights. And they define them as the light weights being less than 1 kilo, which is 2.2 pounders and below. The medium weights being from 1 to 1.5 kilos, so that's up to 3.3 pounds. And then the heavy weights being all the piglets greater than 3.3 pounds. So if I break these down on a every 0.2 kilo basis and we start to see who's really dying, those super light weights, the less than 1 kilos, they have a pre-weaning mortality within that birth weight category of 36%. So you have almost 40% of the less than 1 kilogram piglets dying, but they only represent about 10 to 13% of the total piglets born. So there aren't as many of them, but they sure do die at a pretty fast rate. If you look into the medium weight category, so we go from 1 kilo to 1.6, this represents 55% of all of the piglets born fall into the medium weight category. And as a percent of total mortality, they're 50% of all of the mortality. And what I see interesting here is that as I increase that body weight every 0.2 kilos in that medium weight category, I don't see any improvement in mortality rates as that body weight increases even incrementally. If you look at the heavy weights, we start to see that you start to see a kind of a cutoff where mortality starts to really go down in those body weight categories, 1.6 to 1.8. 1.8 really starts to drop off, right? But these heavy weights, they have low total mortality, but they're only 15% of all of the piglets born. So, perhaps we need to start looking at the medium weights just as much as we tend to try to focus on some of these really light birth weight piglets. Sometimes I get discouraged and think maybe we don't have a lot of hope in saving some of those really light birth weight piglets, but we sure do have a lot of opportunity in that middle medium weight category to truly save piglets. And we might want to focus, they're 55% of all of our piglets born, so we might want to focus some more energy on them. Remember that piglets die typically, the majority of them in the first 3 days after birth, and 40% or more of them are from crushing from the sow. And so that is true for most of our light and medium weight piglets. They are the ones that die early and typically from crushing. The heavy weights tend to die a little later in lactation, usually somewhere after the first week. So we might have to have some different strategies to save piglets at different birth weights and at different times during the lactation process. So where do the lighter birth weight piglets and even the medium birth weight piglets come from? So we know that as litter size increases, this is the same data set looking at litter size going up and piglet birth weight within each litter. As the litter size goes up, birth weight tendency goes down. The other thing you notice is that the spread in these dots gets bigger. And so as you produce more pigs, there's more variation in birth weight within the litter. So more pigs in the litter is lighter birth weight and more variation in birth weight. Same thing, just another data set here, number born alive going up. This is a little older data, but the variation also goes up as you produce more pigs. And I think as we talked about this morning, variation is going to become important. I think we need to start studying variation in data sets more than averages. And that is because I love this data set that showed as birth weight variation goes up, so coefficient of variation going up, the survival goes down regardless of the birth weight category. So light birth weights, medium birth weights, and heavy birth weight piglets, survivability goes down as variation in their birth weight within their litter goes up. So perhaps we need to focus on that a little bit more. Light birth weight piglets, maybe aren't the whole story. So maybe it is about some of that, but some of it's that variation. And then some of it's just having a lot more piglets around. So if you take out a lot of the other factors and you really start just looking at numbers born alive, we can see differences in pre-weaning mortality. We see differences in how much colostrum they drink. So the more piglets they are, the less each individual piglet gets in colostrum to consume. And some of the data from 2012 says that's about 42 milliliters of colostrum less per piglet for every additional piglet born into that litter, is how much less colostrum each piglet gets. So unfortunately, we've done a really great job at selecting for increasing litter size, but sows are not producing any more colostrum. So the more piglets we get, the same volume of colostrum is just getting divided by a bigger number. and that's a problem to me because it's that golden milk of loveliness. So we need to figure out a way to get them all to drink a little bit more. The other thing that happens as litter size goes up is we have behavior changes within that farrowing pen. So we have more piglets that will miss nursings, and there's going to be more fighting. And there's going to be a lot more of those teat disputes, which is basically piglets fighting right against the udder. And so somebody maybe doesn't get a drink of milk because they win the fight to get up to the udder. Okay, so the piglets that do survive, what do they look like? So if you look at this data, mortality in the first 3 days, and basically we're going to say at 24 hours of age, what did those piglets look like that died in the first 3 days after birth? They had, I'm going to try to convince you of some of my numbers here in a minute. So I'm going to say they drank less than 200 grams of colostrum. Grams and milliliters, milk really isn't equal to density of 0, but we're going to just call it that. So 200 milliliters of colostrum consumed in the first 24 hours of life. So they had less than 200 milliliters of colostrum. They lost weight in the first 24 hours, and they were unable to bring their body temperature up to what we would consider normal. They're a little cold still at 24 hours of age. Those pigs that die between day 4 and weaning, they drank over 200 but less than 300 grams of colostrum. They gained a little bit of weight, and their body temperature was pretty close to where we want it to be. So they were able to regulate their body temperature a little better. The ones that are alive at weaning, they drank more than 300 milliliters of colostrum. They gained weight, and they regulated their body temperature. And in all the studies we've been doing on this project, body temperature at 24 hours of age has been a pretty good indicator of colostrum intake and survival in the pigs. If they can actually get enough of that energy to warm themselves up, they seem to do better. So this is a really busy, horrible, awful picture that was published in 2015 that shows all of the factors that lead to piglet death and what increases the likelihood that a piglet is going to get crushed. And so I'm going to focus today on just one of these things, but I think there's lots of opportunities for us to look at within this picture, or all the things that might lead to crushing, and that is genetics companies have some opportunities in there, and management in the barn has a lot of opportunities. But today we're only going to focus on my favorite, the colostrum piece, and what opportunities we have to impact them there. So what is colostrum? So colostrum is Kara's golden milk, but it is also produced in only the first 24 hours from the time of birth of the first piglet until about 24 hours. And it's not the same during that whole period. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But colostrum is basically providing the nutrients that those piglets need to survive and thrive. So it's made up of fat and proteins and sugars and carbohydrates and all the things that you think about. That colostrum then begins to transition into whole milk at a little before 24 hours even. So you can probably by 36 hours there is no colostrum left. But by days 2 and 3 we have kind of this transition milk. And then we get into what is mature milk, and that's going to be a very different milk composition, specifically in protein. So protein goes down as we transition from colostrum into mature milk. And that's all because of the immunoglobulins coming from the mother transferring immune protection to her offspring. The other thing to remember, though, is that colostrum is the milk that is produced in gestation. So it is not being actively produced while she is farrowing and in those first 24 hours. It's already been made. It's already in there. So what happened to that sow those last 2 or 3 weeks in gestation is impacting her colostrum composition and production in lactation. And while there are some opportunities maybe to change some of that, not any data that I've ever seen has been successful at increasing her colostrum production. We can change the components of it. If I change her fat that is in her diet late gestation, I can alter the fat that is in her colostrum, but I really can't make that sow produce more colostrum. So we got to figure that out maybe too. Okay, so why is colostrum so important? So I want to talk about the knowns and the unknowns. And so we know that colostrum is made up of the fat, protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals that the piglets need to survive. It provides their nutrition. It also has immunoglobulins, so it's going to provide them some immune protection and stuff against disease. But it also has all this other stuff, okay? Growth hormones, enzymes, cytokines, things that we really don't know what they do. And those of you that follow research have probably heard of Bartolom Bagnell's lactocrine hypothesis, where they studied one particular hormone in milk called relaxin. And that hormone actually changed the development of the reproductive tract in female offspring. So it stimulated more mature reproductive tract in the offspring. And so that's one example of maybe 1,000 that we haven't researched yet to know what are the impacts of all of these unknowns. We do know that some of these growth factors can mature the gut of the young, and so that suckling piglet gets better nutritional absorption because it matures their gut better when they have some growth factors coming directly from colostrum. So there's a lot of unknowns there. And I'm going to come back to my obsession with milk from a human perspective for a minute. But there's actually really good data in humans of formula-fed versus breastfed babies. And they have very different growth, especially young up to 6 months of age in humans. Breastfed and formula-fed babies will grow very, very different rates. But maybe there's some things we can learn and understand what the impacts of milk are. So if I say some of these out loud, you can tell me if you think they might be important in raising pigs. For example, their immune system is better. They respond better to vaccinations. They have less diarrhea, less gastrointestinal infections. They have fewer upper respiratory infections and pneumonia and influenza. I could argue that those might be benefits in pigs as well, so trying to figure out what the impacts are of milk and how important it is for them is important. Okay, so colostrum. Survival. Number one impact that it has on piglets is survival. And it does that in two ways. The first thing it does is it gives that piglet energy. So as you know from being in the barns, this is what a piglet looks like right when it pops out. It's wet. It's going to get cold when it comes from the body temperature of the sow into our barns. And it is born with very, very little energy reserves. Okay? It doesn't store a lot of fat. And so it has no energy to warm its body back up to the temperature it needs to be. So it needs to drink colostrum to get that energy. So that's the first thing colostrum really does. It helps regulate their body temperature. So this is looking at just some simple data on drying piglets. But all piglets, no matter if we dry them or not, they decrease their temperature right after birth and they have to warm back up in order to survive and thrive. And so colostrum is going to give them fat and carbohydrates and the energy they need to do that. The second way it helps those piglets survive is immune protection. And when we think about immune protection, we're fighting against two different clocks. And we have to fight those clocks pretty darn hard. So the first clock is looking at the time that colostrum is produced. So from the time of the birth of the first piglet, the colostrum quality clock starts. Okay? That's good colostrum. That's the best it's going to get, as a matter of fact. And every minute after that, the colostrum quality goes down. The amount of IgGs, the amount of IgAs, and in that colostrum will start to go down. So your piglets born early are at a much better advantage than your piglets born late. They're going to get the good stuff, 100%. The ones that are born later, that clock has actually already started, and the decline in the concentration of immunoglobulins has already begun. The second clock that you're fighting is the piglet's ability to actually absorb those immunoglobulins and take them into circulation to have immune protection. And so their gut closure, or the little enterocytes in their intestines, begin to close, and that's going to start about 12 hours after birth, and it'll be complete by 24 hours. So even if colostrum production goes a little longer than 24 hours, those piglets really can't absorb it at that point. So we have to get colostrum in those piglets early and as close to the start of farrowing as we possibly can to get the best quality. So this is work from Dr. Bartolozzo, who I really love this graph that they published because it's what literally gives me hope in life in this area. And as you looked at, this is piglet birth weight down here on the bottom. So looking at those medium weights, the 1.1 to 1.3 kilo pigs, and that 200 grams of colostrum cutoff, so if they got 200 milliliters of colostrum. So you see within this little box, the mortality rate is almost 31%. So lighter birth weight piglets that drink less than 200 grams of colostrum, they're probably not going to be a good chance of survival. The way I have hope in life is same body weight, if I can get them to drink more colostrum, their survivability goes way up, and now their mortality rate is only 4%. That's the same as the higher birth weight piglets in their litter. So how do I get them to drink more? I either have to get the sow to produce more, or I have to get the piglet to drink more. So I want to talk about some of those things in a minute. I want to give a little bit of a thought to how much colostrum is really enough, because for years, actually since that data came out in 2002, we have really focused on this 200 milliliters is enough. And I think the word survival and the word thrive are different. And so my personal knowledge here, and this is looking again at just some work coming out of our lab, a couple studies that I put together, if the piglet drinks less than 200 grams of colostrum, we have that high rate of mortality. But if we get them to the 200 grams, survival is usually pretty good. So once they hit 200, they can survive. But that doesn't mean they grow very well. That doesn't mean that they make it through nursery and finishing and all of that successfully. That just means they're able to survive better. So if you kind of go through some literature that shows like what do piglets need to drink, or what kind of growth rate do they need to have to thrive. Thriving I'm defining as success in sows, so stayability in the herd up to a P1, or looking at optimization of obtaining puberty. If we look at those average daily gains and we look at where they fall here on the colostrum intake graph here, you can see we need to be closer to 300 grams of colostrum for them to thrive. So I'm kind of becoming a pusher that our cutoff needs to move from 200 grams to 300 grams to be a really good surviving and thriving pig. And Jeff Vallet's work sort of supports this. He looked at immunocrit as a measure of colostrum intake. And like Dr. Pullman said this morning, there are long-term effects of colostrum intake being reduced. And it goes beyond weaning, it goes all the way to market, and it goes into the sow's productive lifetime as well. So the sows that get, piglets that get too little of colostrum, they grow slower, they don't take more days to reach market weight, and they come into puberty later, they have less total born their first two parities. So long-term effects of not having enough colostrum. And that's just the same data looking at that age at puberty, and as well as their pigs born alive. So just like Jenny talked about this morning, a later age at puberty directly results in lower pigs born alive. So I tried to think about all the things I could come up with that could affect how well a sow produces colostrum. So parity. Our P1s, turns out they're not that great of milkers. So we probably all know that already. But parity 2 and 3, they kind of knock it out of the park in terms of milking abilities. But they aren't going to be great milkers if I don't set them up for that as a P1 and make sure that we kind of manage their mammary glands and get them set up for success for later. Genotype, I'm not going to try to pretend like we know really the difference between the current genotypes. The only data on colostrum production based on genotype is comparing Michon pigs to large whites from back in the 90s. So there are definitely differences there, but what isn't different about a Michon pig? And so I don't know that we know a lot about that, but recently dairy has been able to kind of use some genetic markers to make some improvements in the composition of milk, but they've really only looked at whole milk and not colostrum either. So I'm not sure how well we can say that genotype really affects colostrum production. We definitely know those front teats are better than the back teats in many ways, but colostrum production is for sure one of them. So those front teats produce a lot more colostrum than the hind teats, and usually we find the little tiny piglets are always at the back teats, right? They don't win the teat disputes to make it to the front. They're always at the back. So they're getting lots of disadvantages there, and another one is that those teats aren't producing as much colostrum. Endocrine status, I thought I would just mention a few things that have been shown in some of our recent work here. So one of my studies in the survivability grant was to look at the impacts of farrowing induction on pre-weaning mortality. And we did a study at Purdue and a study on a commercial farm with the mash-offs. And one thing that we did see in terms of colostrum production was that lactose was higher in milk at 24 hours in induced sows than non-induced sows. And we studied like 3 or 4 different induction protocols, and in all of them, the lactose was higher at 24 hours. And what that actually tells me is colostrum production has ended a little bit earlier, because lactose is the indicator that they're transitioning to that whole milk. And so that transition was happening a little earlier in induced sows than non-induced sows. So while I'm actually sort of a fan of farrowing induction when it can be done correctly, this would be one definite negative I would see in farrowing induction, is if we're ending colostrum production early. One other thing that's coming out in the literature, if you're familiar with Chantel Farmer's work, she's been doing some oxytocin injections postpartum, and one thing she's seeing is maybe an extension in the period of colostrum production. She only has really one study published, and she's trying to elucidate some of the details there. It was some pretty whopping doses of oxytocin she gave multiple times after farrowing, and so maybe just something to keep an eye on about whether we could figure out a way to extend the period of time the sow is producing colostrum so that we can get some more into these piglets. I already talked about gestation diet. We can alter the composition a little, but we really can't increase the amount. And then stress. So again, in humans, I know in humans and women that are under an immense amount of stress while they're trying to lactate, or they have a much more difficult delivery of babies, their colostrum production is reduced. And we know that sows that are stressed have a much lower total milk produced. So we don't have a lot of data on stress and colostrum production directly, but I have to imagine that there is some relationship there. And something I think we should think about coming forward is heat tolerant. We're all starting to select a little bit for heat tolerant genetics, and we should start looking at whether our colostrum production is improved or not when we start to evaluate those genetic lines. So if I can't get her to produce more, maybe I've got to get the piglet to drink more. So a couple things about what drives a piglet to drink. One would be thermoregulation, so their nursing behaviors. They got to be warm to want to drink, otherwise they're going to hang out under the heat lamp, right? So the other thing is that competition, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. Birth order, earlier is better. They just get a much better advantage. They get a period of time with free access to every teat if they wanted to drink out of all of them and sample which one they like the best. They get that opportunity, right? The later borns, they don't get that same opportunity. The other thing to start thinking about, which is sort of a difficult thing to measure, but how well those piglets actually absorb the colostrum. So the timing of gut closure is important in that, as well as like their gut function. So villi height of their gut cells at birth, that could really dictate how well they absorb and take in some of these, and that might be a selectable type of thing if we could figure out how to measure it. I don't know, I'm not a geneticist. So this is where my gripe comes, and so I apologize to sound griping here, but you hear anecdotally that we started a split suckling strategy at my farm and our mortality dropped 3%. Or we started drying piglets and blah, blah, blah. And when we come to what data universities have access to, that means you have to publish it for us to be able to see it. And so there's basically not much out there. Even though I know 80% of you in the room who manage data or look at data for any large production system has tried all of these, and you have the data for your system. It's not shared. And so we don't get to see it. And so we're working off of sort of a limited knowledge base. And so the studies that we do have really show no direct effects on pre-weaning mortality is the summation of it all. So anecdotally, when I hear it, I think, well, you put some people in the barn. I'm not sure if drying the piglets is actually saving them, but you put some people in the barn with a job, and that job was to attend to piglets in some way, and turns out we saved a few of them. And so I would love to say that there's some golden answer, some great answer in all of this, that this directly increases colostrum intake and therefore it will save your pigs, start doing it tomorrow, and I don't have that answer. And a lot of it comes down to, I want to go through a few of the studies that are robust enough that I think I could hang my hat on them as being good. So most of you talking about thermoregulation, probably in the past few years, you've seen the data coming out of Mike Ellis's lab, 10,000 piglet study, so you can't get that much better than that. And light birth weight piglets here on the left, heavy birth weight piglets on the right. The blue lines on both of them are the non-dried pigs. The other ones are 3 different methods of drying that they showed. So drying piglets is very, very effective at warming up their body temperature. No questions there. And it's very helpful in light birth weight piglets who really, really struggle to get their body temperature back up, and even at a couple hours after birth are nowhere close to their dried pigs in terms of body temperature. So that I'm not questioning. But unfortunately, the dried pigs had a 16% mortality, 15.7, and the controls had a 16.4. So they were not able to change pre-weaning mortality at all by drying piglets, regardless of body weight also. The only time that drying was beneficial in this study was in light birth weight piglets when the barn was less than 25 degrees Celsius. So don't let your barns cool off too much. Okay, other than that, drying really didn't show a big benefit. This is the kind of data we have access to in terms of published data for split suckling. None of these I'm going to consider are robust. If you look at the number of piglets, we're under 1,000 pigs or right at 1,000 pigs in all these studies. But they did birth order split suckling strategies and body weight strategies. And if you look here, they either didn't measure colostrum intake or pre-weaning mortality, or there was no significant differences at all in colostrum intake or pre-weaning mortality. We're all familiar with Billy Flowers' work from 2008. I was there during this time while we were conducting these studies, and we showed a lot of benefit of raising piglets in small litter sizes, right? They get more milk, they get better nutrition, they get to drink a lot more. And I love this data, except I struggle with it today. And back in 2008, our average litter sizes were maybe 11s and 12s. So it was actually kind of easy for us to go to these commercial farms and cross-foster them around to get litters of 8. Today, in 2021, right? I mean, we could probably not even make 1 litter of 8 in our barns today if we wanted to, right? We'd have to work really hard and we'd run out of teats on somebody, right? So this is great and the knowledge is good, but the actual implementation of this type of strategic cross-fostering maybe isn't going to be realistic at all. So some more recent data coming out looking at uniform versus heterogeneous litters. So basically taking all the light birth weights and putting them together, and then all the heavy weights also go together. And so if you do that type of strategic cross-fostering, you do see a benefit in those mortality rates in those uniform litters. And that was almost all driven by the light birth weight piglets do better when they're only with light birth weight piglets. Okay, so when you put those little guys together, they have less competition, nobody really fights with them, and they end up doing better. They drink more milk, they survive, they grow, they do better. If you actually study this data a little harder, it came at a disadvantage to your heavyweights. So in order to make those litters of all uniform lightweights, you have to make some litters of all uniform heavyweights, right? And in that situation, those heavyweights, all of a sudden, one of them becomes the bottom of the pecking order when they used to be the top, and they don't do as well when they have somebody to fight with them and they have somebody that can actually compete with them at the udder. So it's kind of like taking from Paul to pay Peter, or whatever the saying is, that your lightweights do better, but your heavyweights grow a little less, and that continued on a little bit past weaning, that their growth rate was a little bit lower. Another maybe downside to a lot of the published studies is a lot of them stop at weaning. And we don't really see what happens. We're only getting to halftime in most of the published data sets. We're not going to the end of the game. There's a little bit of data starting to come out and more lately on supplementation. And so I'm just throwing one study up there out of many. Part of the theory, I'm going to be honest with you, when I started the survivability grant, I was hell-bent. I was going to start just giving piglets colostrum. We were going to milk the sows, and I'm going to just give it to them. I know how much they need to get. I'm going to go give it to them. And I was told by 3 different people, Kara, we're not milking sows. Get over it. Okay, fine, I got over it, sort of. I'm still complaining about it though. So I get it. But why not? Why can't we just give them that or something else? So I think there's some opportunity here for us to look at bovine colostrum products. There's already data that shows like feeding bovine colostrum before they drink pig colostrum actually is a better absorptive rate, and the IgGs make it into the piglet better. So maybe we just need to start studying some different types of supplements and when to feed them and how much. So there's still a lot of questions in my mind here on this. You can actually sort of shut that piglet down like Thanksgiving dinner, where they actually don't move again if you give them too much colostrum in a supplement, and then they miss the next 3 nursings because they're sleeping behind the couch on Thanksgiving Day type of a thing. So we need to know exactly how much is enough to be positive and not detrimental. We tried to look at a few things in our projects to stimulate nursing behaviors. So if you work with dairy at all, dairy calves, you can give them a little sugar under their tongue right after they're born, and it stimulates a little suckling reflex, and so they tend to take to a bottle to get their colostrum better. So we thought, why not try that? So we tried just giving them a little pump of 2 mils of colostrum versus 2 mils of evaporated milk, something sweet we could buy easily, and we had no effect on nursing behaviors in those animals. So then we started to look at just a few management things. So this is a little bit busy to walk through, but we did a 2x2 factorial looking at heat lamp location. So while she's farrowing, what if I just put the heat lamp on the side where her udder is? Would that be beneficial than just letting it randomly happen 50% of the time, whichever the way the sow lays down? So we looked at heat lamp being on the udder or the back of the sow, and then where we placed the pigs. So placing the pigs at the vulva or placing them at the udder. And we did not dry them at all. We dried them the teeniest, tiniest bit to use a Sharpie to write a number on their back so we could track them. And so when we looked at that, we ran the data 3 different ways, so looking at all 4 treatments together, and then the effects of just the heat lamp location or where you place the pig individually. And what we saw was that the location of the heat lamp made no difference at all in timing that they approached the udder, when they drank milk, any of those factors. But where you place the pig did matter, which sort of makes sense. If I put the pig next to the udder, she approached the udder faster and she drank milk faster. However, it did not mean that she ended up drinking more colostrum overall in the first 24 hours. So none of these treatments impacted colostrum intake in the first 24 hours, and mortality also was not impacted at all. So I can get her there faster, but I just can't get her to drink more. So I also think we have to think these little piglets, especially these medium and light birth weights, they just don't have the ability, I think, to suckle any harder or drink any more. So that's where I think Mark Schwartz's ideas of lifting those dividers and giving them another mom to go drink a little more off of, maybe one that Big Brother has suckled really hard on and stimulated that udder really good, and then I come in behind and it actually has a lot more milk to give. There's actually some theoretical benefits to that. I'd love to know what all of those piglets in his farm's body weights are at 24 hours so we can see if there's colostrum intake differences and if they're really getting to go get some more colostrum. So there's some, I think those are some interesting ideas. Okay, quickly here, the more teats they have, the more milk and colostrum they produce. So starting to record functional teats, use it as a selection tool, that's been shown to be very positive. Every additional functional teat provides 325 grams more of colostrum, and as I would say, that's more than enough for one more piglet to thrive and survive in that litter. And so they have shown through Mark Knauer's group that litter survival went up by 2.4% with each individual additional functional teat. And then I was joking that, how many of you went to World Pork Expo this year, since it was so nice to actually have World Pork Expo this year? So typically, my favorite thing about World Pork Expo is the AI catheters, okay? I mean, I like to come home with a whole bouquet of them, and I love to see what's new in the designs and which PCAI thing's growing and not growing. And there wasn't one at all of World Pork Expo this year, because everybody was talking about their newest camera and sensor and technology and blah, blah, blah. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't say this is going to be in our future. I don't know what is the best or what is working and not working at this point, but we are going to be having, I think, a lot of this coming in, hopefully to help us save some piglets through some sort of new technology that can identify those at-risk pigs and help us manage them or get attention to them better. So as Jenny said, we usually don't take enough time for acknowledgments, but I obviously, as a university employee, couldn't do anything without the support of people who give us money. And so the Pork Board and the Survivability Grant and the FFAR have been wonderful in helping me get involved in this area. Indiana Pork has supported me very, very well. The Mashoffs have let us onto their farms with lots of undergrads to catch every single piglet born. And then, of course, the students that work for me and deal with me texting them at all hours of the night to make sure we're getting everything collected have been very, very wonderful. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Kara. I suppose we've probably got a few minutes for a quick question.
Going back to your point on milking sows.
Yeah.
Do sows only produce so much colostrum or so much colostrum in a certain time period? So if we could go back to, because it seems like your data pretty much points out if you got colostrum in over 300 grams, you're good. Forget about all the cameras and stuff, it's good. So how do we get
more colostrum? So, I mean, technically, if I'm milking sows, I'm stealing some piglet's meal. So they only produce a set amount over this 24 hours. So, technically, I'm stealing a little bit from one to give to another. But I would argue that at some point we might be directing it to the right piglet. So some of those heavyweight piglets, if you look at Bartolot's thing, are getting 500 grams. They're getting theirs and half of their neighbor's meal, right? So, so we wouldn't take more than 50 mils from each sow, and we would milk multiple teats. So we didn't clean out one whole teat that was left empty for some piglet to be kind of stuck without a meal. So we would kind of milk along the udder a little bit and take 50 to 75 mils from each sow, freeze it, and then we would just kind of start to give it to piglets. And we didn't have enough data to show whether it's helpful or not at this point. But what we also did was we would milk a bunch of sows and then we would bottle feed piglets so they only got a set amount and see what happens when they are, for sure, same colostrum composition. So we just used one huge jug. Everybody got the same exact composition, but just the amount was different. Those piglets that were below 200 milliliters of colostrum, they couldn't regulate their body temperature. They were cold, and majority of them died. So I don't know how to get it in them. I mean, I know how to get it in them. It's just, do you want to go through getting them out? The other thing I thought about putting a technology in there is, turns out the human breast pump does a great job at milking sows. If one person could just change the cup a little bit, turns out human breasts and pig breasts are a little bit of a different shape, that the suction isn't as perfect. But I've taken my breast pump into the farm and hooked it up, and I can actually, the good news is, I can get more colostrum out of that teat than probably a light birth pig weight suckling can. So I can get a good amount of colostrum out and have it ready to go without stealing too much from anybody else. So there might be some technologies where we just need to hook up a milker once in a while and get some to have around. Yeah?
Sure. So, great talk.
Thanks.
The premise is, if you get more colostrum into them, that causes benefits.
Correct.
What if the piglet at birth, for whatever reason, innate reason, has bigger appetite? So it's not that the increased colostrum is causing a benefit, it's just that some piglets are healthy, they're less immune activated, and they have a robust appetite.
Yeah. I think this is where the interaction between birth weight and intrauterine growth retardation and colostrum intake kind of start to wiggle around. And I would almost argue that some of those really light birth weight piglets we don't have a chance of saving. I might even pump a lot of stuff into them, and they are part of that intrauterine growth retardation. They have a million other issues. They're going to die anyway. But this is where I might start to argue some of those lighter middleweight category pigs, what if I can just get enough into them? You know, the 1 to 1.3 kilo ones. What if I just focus on them and maybe kind of have to let the really light ones go? And so those pigs, I think, have the potential to take off if I can get enough in them. And I would assume if they're at that birth weight category that there isn't a lot of other innate problems with them. But the appetite, the size of the stomach, those little tiny, less than 1 kilo piglets, I mean, their stomach's teeny tiny. And when we would bottle feed them, I couldn't even get more than them to drink 10 milliliters before it was coming back up. And we would tube feed some of them if they didn't have a suckling reflex, which a lot of them are born without a suckling reflex. They wouldn't take to a bottle. But I would tube feed them for the first couple of feedings, and I couldn't go above 15 mils before it was like they were regurgitating. So I think they have a smaller capacity. But those were typically pretty lighter birth weight piglets. The medium ones, once I got them to take to a bottle, they were drinking 30 and 40 mils every 2 hours.
Kara, thanks for your presentation. You know, this is such a critical area, and it's very difficult to get a handle on it, but theoretically, we know we can change milk composition.
Yes.
We know we can change the amount of milk. We ought to be able to do the same with colostrum. So I'm wondering, from your standpoint, what keeps colostrum production and composition of colostrum being limited? And is there any, if you were to blue sky, to say, is there a nutrient, is there a compound that would accelerate colostrum composition quality or colostrum quantity?
So that's a great question. So two things, quality and quantity, right? So quality, you know, I can change her fat, I can feed her more fat at the end of gestation and I get more fat in her milk. And that fat is energy for the piglet. Never seen a lot of data that shows whether that is beneficial to the survival and thriving of the piglet. They stop at, well, it changed her milk composition. Okay. So I think there's opportunity there. How do I get her to produce more? She's sort of limit fed at the end of gestation. And so I don't know if that's a limiting factor to colostrum production, but we have to go back to that time frame, right, of when she's producing it. The other thing is when she's actually developing her mammary tissue is throughout pregnancy. And so her mammary gland development starts at the beginning of pregnancy, and they have no milk producing sows until they get pregnant. Their whole lifetime they have none until they get pregnant. And so perhaps even something that we can do to stimulate more milk producing cells. If there's a nutritional component to that, I'm not sure I know what that is, but there has to be sort of a genetic component to that if we could figure out what to measure and what to look at is how well they develop big, huge milk-producing
Is it
glands.
possible to use hyperimmunization to stimulate colostrum quality?
That's a great question. I don't know. Like where you're thinking.
For vaccines, and no vaccines cause some of that.
Does for that given titer, right?
Right,
That's-
yeah, that's what I'm.
What stimulates IgG or IgM?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of dietary things that do stimulate that, right? That change, increase immunoglobulin,
Right.
but it doesn't seem to produce more total milk.
So is the amount of colostrum produced related to the amount of her total milk produced, like a dairy cow? Okay, like obviously your backyard regular Angus is quite a bit different than your Holstein. I mean, I'm sure Holstein produces way more milk than
Yes.
even colostrum than that. So it's got to be a genetic.
So colostrum and total milk are stimulated by different things. So total milk is going to be suckling stimulus. So, and that's the other thing. Those little, when you cross foster into those kind of all light birth weight things, they don't have very good suckling stimulus. She won't produce anywhere near as much milk as those ones that are trying to nurse all those big ones. But colostrum isn't responsive to suckling stimulus or litter size. So you would kind of think that it would have made more sense biologically, whoever made the decision, that, you know, like that if there's more in there, we know that, and maybe we should start to produce a little bit more, but that doesn't seem to be correlated at all.
It's not demand.
It's not demand.
But still volume would not be genetically. I mean,
I think there has to be a genetic trait to that. I don't know if anybody knows what it is to select for and exactly what gene that is. And like I said, I don't look at dairy much, but they have some candidate genes that have been very good at whole milk changes, but I don't know that they've ever done anything with colostrum either, so that's an area we should look into. Yeah, I know, but maybe we could take their colostrum and do something with it.
Really good discussion. Don't want to inhibit. So obviously, it's one of the values of a conference like this is be able to have the valuable discussion. Kara will be around later to answer any more questions, but just for the sake of time, we'll move on to the next presenter.